Before we get started today, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we work from in central Victoria, the Dja Dja Wurrung people in the beautiful Jara country, and extend our respect to First Nations people, both right across central Victoria, but also across the various lands that we are joining from today. And I welcome invite you all to enter into the chat the lands on which you're joining us from today, noting that we've got some fantastic people from right across Australia. And thank you for your attendance in that regard. My name is Nina O'Brien. I'm the lead of disaster recovery and resilience here at FRRR. I'm joined by some wonderful colleagues and collaborators on the call today. Nancy Sposato, the Program Manager for Disaster Resilient Future Ready, both here in Victoria and in Queensland. Welcome, Nancy. We're also joined by our long-term collaborators and guest speakers, Dr. Pam Joseph and Professor Amanda Howard from the University of Sydney. We're also joined today by the wonderful community representatives who've been working with us for so many years now on this work. Jill Graham over at Myrtleford. Welcome, Jill. Kerry Clark also joins us from Whittlesea. Welcome, Kerry. Also will convey some contributions from Nolene Cosm, a valuable group at Corumburra Staying Strong, but who's on the road travelling and I hope is able to join us online or at least listen to the recording after the session today. Also valuable tech support in the background. Big shout out to you, Fiona Bradshaw, for helping us guide the webinar presentation today. Some quick housekeeping before we jump into the session itself. As I mentioned, the session will be recorded today. We do request that you stay on mute during the session, if that's okay, and then we will open up for discussion. Do feel free, though, to use the chat function. We welcome your contributions, comments, observations, and questions, and we will have time for questions at the end of the session. Nancy will monitor that chat. And also welcome some questions from you all of the speakers today. If you don't mind, just pop some context about your name and your role in the disaster resilience building sector when you pop your question into the chat, if that's helpful. So let's get started. The purpose of today's session is to provide a brief history and context of our work building disaster resilience right across regional, rural and remote Australia, both in the context of Disaster Resilient Future Ready program, but also the broader 25-year history of FRRR itself. We'll hear some key learnings from our team at University of Sydney and indeed our community members with regard to the key learnings that have been captured in the report that we're pleased to release today. We'll also have some key takeaways for the multiple stakeholders that we know that are on the call today. And of course, valuable thanks and deep recognition for our valued partners and wonderful donors that enable this work to occur. It's wonderful to see those comments coming through the chat there in terms of where people are joining us from today. It's fantastic. Thank you. So a quick skate across the surface of how this work came about in the first place before we hear about the report. FRRR, or the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, we're pleased to celebrate our 25th anniversary this year. And that really was a valuable opportunity to take a moment to reflect on the work that we have undertaken in regional, rural and remote communities and just the deep impacts that disasters in particular of so many different varieties have impacted regional communities across that time. It's always been a really critical part of how we support communities to both respond to but also recover from disasters across that time. Throughout that rich experience in delivering small grants to those hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of communities, we observed particular aspects of community life that enabled people to move through recovery more effectively, not necessarily more quickly, but aspects of community life that helped communities respond effectively. we saw that strong social capital, high levels of inclusion, diverse leadership, having those diverse voices at the table of decision making, and that deep and multifaceted connection across community and emergency management were some of the key elements that really factored into a successful recovery. So since 2012, FRRR has been actively invested and interested in and talking to our partners about what interventions, positive interventions, or role that we can play ahead of disasters so that communities are more prepared, they're more informed, they're more skilled to cope with those disruptions when they inevitably will occur, depending on what sort of disaster type they might be. So that has seen us work in New South Wales across a variety of communities. We were partnering with the University of Sydney then. We were pleased to continue that relationship now into Victoria, partnering with an additional 3 communities that you will hear about today, and also noting that we're delivering this work across several diverse regions in Queensland as well. Continues to sort of add to our learnings. In simple terms, the aims of the program were to support and strengthen the capacity of communities to thrive and be resilient to the impacts of disasters and disruptions. And even since the initial start of this program, certainly the depth and number of disasters and overlay disasters that have and are continuing to occur across Australia has certainly evidenced the need for this type of positive intervention. The focus was on building grassroots community organisations to be connected to the complex and help them understand the complex emergency management structure, and to deliver skill development, capacity building, a whole range of interventions and supports, such as coaches, along with small grants to help them build disaster resilience ideas and aspirations over time. A really critical part of that was the action research with the University of Sydney to both build upon the existing evidence base that we initially developed in New South Wales, and then to really continue to test some of those ideas to form the robust sort of theoretical framework that softly underpins this work. We also know that this work takes time. So the last 4 years, we kicked off this work in late 2020. It was, I think we so quickly forget, but it was deep COVID lockdowns during early 21 in particular. And so a big shout out to the communities who have worked with us through that time, your deep sort of perseverance and tenacity, and to our friends at USID to sustaining the work over this time. So it's truly exciting that we're here today to be able to share these learnings with you. I'm going to hand over to Amanda from the University of Sydney to take you through some of the action research approach. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Nina. And hi, everyone. I'm Amanda, one of the people from Sydney Uni, along with Pam and Margot, who are both here today. I'm very excited to talk about this research we've been involved with for a long time now. I'm just going to briefly just talk about action research. There's probably a lot of people on the call who are really across action research, who know exactly what it is, so apologies to you. But for people who are not so familiar with it, I just wanted to quickly say we very deliberately and very intentionally took an action research approach in this work for 3 big reasons. One is that action research, because it's cyclical, it's about planning, acting, reflecting and refining, doing some more planning based on that, and then acting again. We were able to gather data through the entire project, and that data could be utilised straight away by communities, by FRRR, and by researchers as well. So the action research provides us with this fantastic live process, dynamic process, whereby we can gather information, analyse it, and actually utilise it throughout the whole kind of process. The second reason why we have used this approach is because in action research, participatory action research, the data that we actually gather is co-owned, it's co-designed, it's co-developed, and it's co-owned by everyone who's involved in the process. So it's a really, I think, important part of this research, that any information that we gathered was available to communities, to FRRR, but also co-owned and being able to be utilised equally across that kind of process. And I guess the third reason why we utilised action research and why it's really important. And I'd recommend it to, we would definitely recommend it to anyone who's trying to do any work in disaster kind of resilience as a way of keeping track of what you're doing and documenting that kind of work. Action research allows the process to refine, to adapt, to develop and to change in response to what's happening with the community. So we don't have to wait to the end of the research project to go, oh, this is what we found. Geez, we should have done that instead. Or if it only we'd done this instead. Because of this cyclical kind of character of it, we're able to actually look as we're going along and go, oh, wow, we've learned this. We thought this was going to work. We learned this, but maybe it needs to adapt or change, or maybe we need to do something different here. That didn't really work. And so it supports knowledge building that can be immediately utilized to adapt and change a project. So that's a kind of action research in a nutshell. I'm going to hand over to Pam now, who's going to talk to us about another aspect of that, I guess, the intentional way in which we went about this research. Over to you, Pam.
Thanks, Amanda, and hi, everybody. So this graphic will be familiar to some of you and maybe new to others. We're not going to go into it in great depth and detail this morning or this afternoon, but it has been published in the Australian Journal of Emergency Management. You'll be able to find it there. The reference is down in the bottom right corner of the slide there. So I'm just going to give you a little bit bird's eye view of what it is and how it underpinned some of our learning out of the DRFR project in Victoria and previously in New South Wales. So we'd consider this, I guess, a bit of a framework for action. So it's ideas and it's concepts, but the intention of it is that it's actually usable by communities, by researchers, by anybody who is working with communities in this disaster community building resilience space. The circle around the outside of community preparedness is kind of what I guess contains it in a conceptual way. But within that, we have complexity concepts, adaptability, interconnectivity, nonlinearity, emergence, and dynamic context that I'll just explain briefly in a moment. But that sort of sense of complexity that sits behind work with communities, and then with that, these 7 petals in the flower, for want of a better description of it, that show 7 different dimensions that we've found have been really useful as a framework, both for support, for information gathering, and for future action in community resilience building. So this is not a list. These dimensions interact with each other. They move over time and shift. One of the ways that we used this in terms of the action research was that the research team would sit down with each community on 6 different points across, 4 to 6 different points across the research period, and try and sort of map out visually where the energy was, where the priorities were, where the action had been happening, so that you get a bit of a shifting picture over a period of time. So it's quite a different way of gathering and documenting information and evidence around community resilience building. Decision-making, networks, information, self-organising systems, inclusion, communication and resources are all different aspects that communities can be seen in a community. So when we first meet with a community, or if a community is first undertaking some of the thinking around this, these are aspects that they may well be able to explore, to develop a deeper understanding of what's happening. But each of these things interact with others. So, for example, information and networks. Information might be shared across networks. Networks may include some people but not include others in a community, but that shifts and changes over time. So when we're mapping these things out, it's really important to remember that although it's a 2-dimensional image, that's very limited in itself, because it actually works over really 3 dimensions of interaction and depth, but also that at any static point, the size, for example, of the petal is interpreted differently. For example, if we talk about resources, in one visual, in one part of the action research, we might see that that might be relatively small. That might mean that there's a lack of resources and that needs to be made a priority, but it might also mean that resourcing is not a high priority for that community at that time, and that maybe the energy is elsewhere. So it's also a stimulant for discussion and for guiding where future knowledge gathering and for future action might occur. In terms of the complexity concepts there, the adaptability, the interconnectivity, non-linearity, emergence and dynamic context, these are all quite high-level concepts, I guess, in a lot of ways, but they're quite foundational to understanding how communities build resilience. And we feel that this is a really important part of this approach because traditionally, community resilience building and research projects tend to be quite linear and they tend to be quite contained, a beginning point, a midpoint, an end point. And then there's a risk that that is sort of closed off and people walk away. With this, what we're saying is this is just part of an ongoing history, an ongoing experience and activity for communities. And so oversimplifying risks failure in terms of trying to achieve set goals. So what this approach is saying is that this is moving, it's dynamic, things emerge, it's hopeful, it's creative, it's innovative, but it's also very complex and things can happen that are unpredictable, things might end up in a dead end, but other new aspects might come in the course of that community's work that had not been anticipated that might be quite crucial in terms of the future. So we might move on to the next slide. And I'm just going to really briefly point you in this direction, but we can come back to that later if that's useful. The research questions were broadly about just understanding what works well with communities, what hindrances were they had encountered, what things were supportive, what aspects of DRFR as a program were most useful or have most potential for being further developed. And then what were the key learnings and the insights that might inform future DRFR activities. So Nancy, I will pass on to you for our next slide.
So I'm going to do my best to try and capture the array of activity that happened in the communities. I'm going to kick off with Korumburra. So I guess to link back to the dimensions for a moment through the impact research, it was evident that there was a clear inclusive focus throughout the process in Korumburra, and there was a strengthening of networks and communication systems. I guess that what that looked like in activity, there was multiple community planning meetings. There was a community day held early in the piece at the Korumburra Railway Precinct, which had really thoughtful planning to enable, even drop-in engagement. There was the development of the Korumburra Staying Strong group, and again, they were seeking diverse community input to inform plans and action. There was the focus to connect the high school at one point to support inclusion for young people. This included a creative mural project in a local tunnel. I'm imagining an underpass of sorts. Council relationship was also developed through that project, but they had to pivot due to heritage needs, but council was able to take that initiative on. Korumburra Staying Strong did shift to website development and volunteer connection project through Helping Hands, and a website was launched post-lockdown around this volunteer community group connection project. A range of community groups participated, again, engaging community to contribute to potential projects and actions. There was a community connector employed, which in time led to further community development and social media focus, which was able to expand relationship building and communication work of Korumburra Staying Strong. But I think importantly, this multi multi-way communication with multiple stakeholders in that community. Then post a storm event in Korumburra, Korumburra Staying Strong was able to activate social media platforms to gather feedback in terms of resilience planning from community. And these efforts were then fed into a community resilience planning project, which included a council collaboration and a launch event at the community hub where emergency services were present to share information with community. As Nina referenced at the beginning of the session, Nolene Cosson from Korumburra Staying Strong is having some fantastic downtime at the moment, and so I did speak to her during the week. And in regards to these themes that presented in Korumburra through the action research, networking, inclusion, and experimentation and creativity in their approaches, there was a multiplicity of approaches. And I asked Nolene what kept the group's focus on inclusion and creativity. And I'll share Nolene's response. Through the DRFR community, through the DRFR program, the community coach, through the community coach, we understood that inclusion was something we needed to consider. Who is not in the room? Everyone contributed ideas on how to do this. From my business association experience, I knew we needed to pique the community's interest in how we engage them in events, be it update them on some new infrastructure in town or have a free barbecue. We also noticed that for these events, open spaces were more conducive to community engagement. People were less likely to enter a hall. And Nolene reiterated, we took every opportunity to collect community ideas so that community felt like they were contributing. Whittlesea. So in Whittlesea, they kicked off with a small group with extensive experience of working together. There was a clear goal from the beginning of the program to reimagine and reinvigorate the community emergency plan, which would be recognised in the Municipal Emergency Management Plan. Communication and information would be enabled by greater clarity about roles of individuals. And in the final data collection, attention was turning to build networks and inclusion. So with Whittlesea, there was a clear focus from the start on this formal recognition. Before any work could be possible. That was, I guess, that starting point for the group. New support from council and emergency management services was brokered, and the group clarified what was required in regards to the formal recognition for an emergency response plan and network. FRRR funds were utilised to employ a person to assist with the planning and documentation. But also council staff support was vital in providing guidance and advice on procedural requirements for formal recognition and advocacy inside the emergency management system. Though there were challenges when a key staff member moved on, and the group had to regather momentum in this really detailed work. New connections needed to be built with council about the group's work and priorities. With recognition on the horizon, the group was proactive in networking to develop a community emergency response network. That was where they were putting their focus, and they were shifting from a small group to broadening networks. Amanda, I'm going to throw to yourself and Kerry.
Thanks, Nancy. So you know, you can see already that, you know, in Korumburra, there was a real emphasis around inclusion and connecting people. You know, in one way, in Whittlesea, this real focus on recognition and for community being recognised as legitimate knowledge holders and actors in the emergency management process was such a big kind of emphasis. We were blown away through this process by the longevity and patience and creativity of the group in Whittlesea, who'd worked literally and continue to work, but have been working for decades on this issue, this really important issue that comes up over and over again. So, Kerry, thanks so much for being here today representing the Whittlesea group. And I just had a question around, from your perspective, why is recognition of community work in formal systems important, and why was it so important and is it so important to the group in Whittlesea?
Thanks, Amanda. We started out after the bushfires and have been running ever since as a community committee. And we decided we wanted to develop an emergency plan, which we developed into a simple handbook in 2015. And we had some grants to do that. And the handbook was good and everyone really liked it, but it didn't hold any sway. It didn't say, look, these people are the right people to come to if there's an emergency. It had no recognition, no credibility inside that emergency system. So we realised early on that we were, rather than just update the handbook and make it a fresh plan, we were going to have to do something different. We were going to have to slot into the municipal emergency planning system and be part of that system if we wanted to be seen as a genuine player in emergency response and recovery. So, it was particularly driven by Judy, who's FRRR, Victorian Farmers Federation rep, and she was very strong on saying, oh, look, I'm not going to be bothered with this unless we can get recognition. And she was right. So she pushed really hard for that. And I think that in the end, what we've got is an amazing complex plan, which isn't really in our language. It's really in the language of the municipal agencies, because that's how the only way we were going to fit in was to join into that language. And so now we are very proud that we have formulated a plan, and it is a community plan, and it forms the first layer of planning for the municipal emergency plan. So hopefully it can be shared with other organisations and they won't have to spend however many years we spent writing it. They'll be able to use ours as a model.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazingly determined effort, I think, and really detailed effort that the community has actually been engaged in for a very, very long time. I know we don't have very much time, but I just wanted to, if you could quickly just talk to us about next steps, which is the network, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so, ideally it was all going to be done all at once, but it was so unrealistic. So what the important thing now is to develop what we're calling a community emergency response network out of all the local community organisations, all feeding into a central place in the event of an emergency, that we can coordinate with one another and help people immediately and help them within the system, so that we're not brushed aside by the powers that be, but we're part of that, and we can do what we do best, or each of the organisations can do what they do best, and to develop that as a genuine network. We've got no money now, so we'll have to find some more money if we can get that to happen. That's probably really where we've been heading all along. But the plan had to be done first.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much, Kerry. We could talk for the next hour about all the work that Willsy's done, but we need to move on. So I'm going to hand back to Nancy now to talk a little bit about Myrtleford. But thanks so much, Kerry.
No worries.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda and Kerry. So Myrtleford, accessing the resources to support community action on resilience was a high priority. These resources were not only financial, but also human, including networks, relationships and motivations. Communications with Council of Emergency Management and with the broader community about disasters was a focus throughout the Myrtleford DRFR partnership. Meetings were held with community leaders and key groups, and they focused their attention on not duplicating other activities that were occurring in the local area. A community connector role took time to scope and fill, but once established, this role engaged community groups in one-on-one contact with community leaders, groups and individuals to listen and understand. Community workshops were held. The role highlighted and connected the group's common ground. There was a loss in momentum when the connector role culminated, though some community groups did start to focus on the first 72 hours post-disaster planning project and meet regularly to form a network, as well as engage in a disaster scenario workshop held by the SES. Work continued by the network on a local action plan and a secretariat support from the neighbourhood centre. The group included leaders with high skill and commitment, and support from the neighbourhood centre was seen positively. In the culmination of the data collection, the network was still in early stages of development, though paying close attention to including diverse community members and engaging with local knowledge and experience to continue the first 72 hours post-disaster related events. I'll throw again to you, Amanda. Oh, sorry, Pam, I think is going to. Pam and Jill, super.
Thanks, Nancy. Look, from the research point of view, I guess one of the things, and coming back again to that action framework that we talked about earlier, each community had a really unique context and experience, but each community had something that I think other communities can learn from. And so for Myrtleford, we were really aware of the importance of timing and of time, that the DRFR project enabled the community work to unfold over a period of time. And for Myrtleford, this was a really important part of just getting the moment that worked for the Myrtleford community. There was a lot else going on, and like every community across, well, the whole world, but Victoria certainly, COVID had an impact. Coming along then with COVID meant shifts in community populations, people moving in from metropolitan areas, moving out to regional towns. Also, Myrtleford, and Jill, I'm sure will mention this, Myrtleford has a really shifting population with people coming for holidays and maybe not living full time. So the importance of gestation and patience, and really finding a way through to building disaster resilience over a period of time in a way that's not always possible in very time-limited projects, and the importance of curiosity. So learning about what was in the area, community assets, processes, resources, who was around. And so, Jill, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the question that was on the slide that was just there a moment ago and is now gone. Thank you. I had it written down in front of me. How would you recommend taking the time to build relationships and to find the right starting point from your experience in Myrtleford?
Well, we found that you can't rush into this work. There is no right or wrong way. One piece of learning leads to another opportunity. So when we started out, you know, we started heading in one direction, and then I think we changed direction a little bit. Look, before DRFR project, Myrtleford Neighbourhood Centre was involved in a neighbourhood house project enabling communities. It came at a really bad time because it was when COVID lockdowns and everything, so we couldn't get out in the community. But in conducting this research for the project, we connected with community members from Kinglake to get their perspective on their experiences following the devastating 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. A clear message was that before the fires, there were 60 or so community organisations who had very little knowledge of each other, and how supporting it would have been if they had, and how important it was to have these relationships. So we took that learning and focus into the DRFR project. We were mindful that the community had been through so much in recent times with the bushfires and COVID, and did not want to burden them. So instead of having a meeting with community groups as a whole, we went out individually to each group to start off, and then went on to hold meetings as a group, allowing organisations to host meetings at their facilities. It was extremely valuable to visit many of our community groups at their prospective facilities, and to take the time to get to know what each group does, learning what resources they have, their needs, and how these assets could be utilised in the future. Since DRFR, we have worked on collecting stories in partnership with Kintsugi Heroes from people in the community, and capturing their experiences during the 2019-2020 bushfires for future reference. In 2023, the Alpine Bushfire Recovery Stories was published and presented at a community book book launch. Through this process, there was valuable insight into a diverse collection of individuals' experiences. Our focus as a group now is on communication to groups, expanding the groups that we have contacted and the broader community members, and including our most vulnerable, which are the hardest ones to connect. I don't know whether you can see, this is the book that came out. It's online, and it's a great little book.
Thanks so much for that, Jill. I'm realising that with time we might need to move along, but we can certainly come back and have more conversation about all three communities' experiences later. So we might just move along now, if that's okay, to some of the learnings and the insights through the research. I'm going to be quite quick with this slide and then hand over to Amanda to unpack a bit further. But the two key learnings that we wanted to just highlight in this webinar were firstly the value of the resilience dimensions approach that the DRFR action research really illustrated, that looking at those 7 dimensions was a way of opening up thinking and action. It wasn't a way of constraining and forming a rigid framework, but a means of opening up thinking and thinking towards action. It was also a way of making sense of experiences as they unfolded. So like I was saying earlier, with those petals on the flower, they shift and move in size and relationship to each other and intersection with each other over the period of time. And the 3 or 4 years that we were meeting with communities, we were able to see how using that framework, the resilience dimensions, helped to make meaning from the experiences that communities were having. And that it's a way of thinking rather than a checkbox list. So it's not a laundry list of 7 different items to tick off, but very much more a way of just leading our thinking, I guess, and leading for communities, leading their thinking around understanding their communities. And the other key learning was around really reiterating what we've talked about previously, the benefits of complexity thinking, understanding that there are a whole multiplicity of factors that can influence how communities experience and then work with resilience building in their areas, and that it's contextual for every community at any different time. It's going to be different and it changes over time and is endlessly dynamic, but that's hopeful and creative. I'll hand over to Amanda to talk a little bit more about some of the other insights that we developed over the course of the research.
Thanks, Pam. So I guess what we to some extent, this dimensions kind of approach that we kind of used, it came from a long process of research over decades of being across and looking through all the different published research that was around and other kind of community knowledge and knowledge that was around, and that's kind of how the shape and the process came. And to some extent, we wanted in this process to be able to go, is this any good? Like, does it actually help people? Is it? And I think that's what I think, Pam, what you're just saying is that it was kind of good that we found that it was good because it was flexible, because it recognised that things are shifting and moving, because it didn't try and lock things down into this staged, manufacturing style kind of program development kind of idea. And it's much more suited to thinking about community life and also community resilience building. So in terms of what we found for insights, the program, was really effective because there was time and it allowed for unique solutions to be developed in each community. It was actually based on thinking and ideas. It wasn't just, we're just going to do stuff and see what happens, but it was kind of like, we're going to think about it, we're going to use these ideas, and then we're going to actually see what happens and then test how that actually went. There was a particular focus across the board on networks and inclusion, on those relationships, and also just that capacity, which was really great in this kind of project, in this program, to actually to shift and move and to adapt and respond, to changing situations in communities. Obviously, it's kind of a bit of a truism to say that relationships are important. Anyone who does works in communities knows that's important. But we actually found that it's really important to think about relationships, not in this kind of linear way. We're going to have this many, and then we're going to lead to this one, and then we'll lead to this one. But actually, that people bring lots of different networks with lots of different nodes and lots of different kind of starting points, and then those things connect together further, and that actually was a really good, important part of if we're thinking about networks, not to think about them as a building block, but actually to think about them in a much more dynamic way. And it's really, really important in funded programs that the actions and the decisions of funders, of policymakers, of governments, and of other intermediaries as well, they can shape and impact the parameters for communities, the capacity to actually come up with new solutions. They can shut down space and they can open up space. So being mindful, as if you're a policymaker, if you're a funder, if you're a government agency, to not be reductive in your thinking, but actually to set things up so that it can be expansive, so it can be creative. And so, and a lot of the time, a focus on the plan. There's lots of focus on plan. You must do a plan. You must have planning in this kind of very formalised organisational way. In this project and in the previous iteration of it too in New South Wales, that can actually be quite a drain on communities without a sense of it being purposeful and meaningful for that community in that context. Why are we planning? What are we planning for? Who are we? How are we connecting together? So just having a plan as this kind of weird amorphous thing or as a reductive piece of paper was not helpful. People found it like, oh, it's demotivating. But doing planning in meaningful ways likely was really important. One of the things that's often a real challenge for organisations generally is being able to have consistency of staff and resources over the program, over the life of any kind of program. And the way that resourcing and support is provided is really critically important. There's no magic answer to this because people come and go from jobs, and that's actually what happens. But certainly we saw in this project that if you can have consistency of people so that community members don't have to continuously make new relationships and start over again with one person after another, makes a significant difference. We've talked about flexibility, and I think that flexibility was such an important part of the entire kind of process, and that everything was founded on local knowledge, and that kind of recognition and inclusion of the fact that there's creativity in local communities, and that's what we actually need to think about. People who are making change in local communities are wearing lots of hats. They're seeing a lot of things that are going around, and they are embedded in the creative solutions that are in those communities. Volunteer time is significant. It's more significant than it ever gets measured, and it's really, really important that resource of volunteerism doesn't just get drawn down and drawn down and drawn down without recognising how much energy goes into that and how much of a contribution, if you costed it out, it actually kind of would be. And again, we've just talked about how it was important to really tap into and really respect the community's existing knowledge, not go in assuming like, oh, thank goodness I'm here with my great expertise coming in. Again, it's an obvious thing to say, but we're all surprised to see how often that actually happens. Okay, so throughout the whole process, everyone had to expect the unexpected. There was no straight lines. Things emerged. Some things ended up as a dead end, and then people kind of went around and found a new way to go. Some things they seemed like they were going to be a good idea, but then people lost momentum for them, or they didn't turn out to be good ideas. So then they had to recalibrate, regather energy, and go somewhere else. Being across that, not as a failure, like, oh, we tried that and it didn't work, but actually as an important, vibrant process in the creativity of being able to experiment, be able to try new things, and being supported to actually to experiment and shift and change when things aren't kind of working was really important. Time, again, was really a critical kind of thing, and time for things to actually emerge, and for funding and support to actually recognise that you're probably not going to see a result in 6 months or 12 months. It's going to be a much longer kind of process. And I guess the other thing in this kind of space is that which I've talked about before, reducing, oversimplifying, it actually was 100% unhelpful. It was 100% unhelpful. And in this project, we were able to see when that didn't happen, when we were able to see that the complexity was recognised and that there were lots of different pathways and lots of different ways in which people were actually engaging, that made things thrive when that happened. So that was a really critically important part of the success of this project. So just very quickly, I know we're nearly out of time, but in terms of program design, we had some recommendations. I've just talked about not oversimplifying, but what we saw was that actually making processes accessible and easy to do for communities, people who don't have much time, people who've got multiple responsibilities, being able to actually have processes, whether that's accessing money or planning or accessing other resources or working together, having processes that really don't get in the way of that but actually support people to better do it as they can was critically important. The coaches were an important part of the early part of the project, and I think the learning here is that having coaches that are local, if you're going to have coaches, having coaches that are local is really very important, and also then just having them have enough time with the community to actually start building those kind of relationships. So again, thinking about how much time can we put into a coach and who locally could we actually get to actually do that role. And again, because there was an intentional learning process in this project, people were learning by doing all the time, and that knowledge building and that capacity building of knowledge and research and action was throughout the whole process. Just in terms of program implementation, we've talked about flexibility and adaptation over time. So important, can't say it enough. Also, cross-community connections, is a really important thing that often gets neglected, that communities can learn from each other. That peer-to-peer kind of learning can be such an important part of the process, so that people don't feel so isolated, or they can actually look and say, oh, they're doing that over there. That might be kind of interesting for us to learn too. We've always also talked about that recognition of those in-kind contributions that are enormous, and often people say they recognise volunteerism, but actually the scale of it needs to be much better kind of recognised. And finally, one of the things that people said in the communities over and over again is that it's really important to pay close attention to adaptive and responsive administrative support. So designing administrative support so it's not an additional burden for volunteers. Oh, now we've got to try and hire someone, we've got to try and do human resources, we've got to try and do all that sort of stuff. But thinking and working and negotiating with that community about what would helpful administrative support look like for your project. So that's kind of in a nutshell. There's much more detail in the report, which I invite you to read.
Thanks, Amanda. And look, it was always going to be an ambitious hill to climb, covering 4 years of rich learning in a simple 1 hour webinar. So thank you for those contributions to you all. Before we move into questions itself, we do just have some takeaways for the various sectors that we have on the call today. But before we do that, I would invite you all to fashion a question and pop it in the chat if you have questions for either any of our researchers on the call, or indeed our community members or our staff. So thank you, Nancy. Recognising that the emergency management space and the building of community-led resilience is wonderfully complex and multi-layered, and it takes many people and organisations and multi-layered efforts over time to build genuine community resilience. We do just have some quick takeaways for the various sectors that are on the call today. So to the community members who have tuned in, thank you for your time. It's really valuable. The hand on heart, your local leadership is incredibly powerful. Never underestimate just how fantastic your knowledge, relationships and commitment to this work, just how very important that is to building community-led resilience. you're what might feel like an average sausage sizzle down the street, or just holding a community event, putting stuff on your local notice board, might seem really simple, but it's an incredibly powerful way to raise the profile of this work and engage facets of the community that honestly emergency management and local government often find it really challenging to do. Also connecting with those sectors to help build understanding of local risks with local community members who may not engaged in more formalised processes is also an incredibly powerful role that you play to genuinely co-create those solutions that really make a difference at a grassroots community level. And I think we've heard a lot about that today. I'm always pretty amazed by the networks and connections and the simple practical ability of community members to know who they need to get on the phone to when they need to get something done in a small regional community. That's one of the very magnificent superpowers, I think, of community-based networks and people in the work that we see. Never underestimate the value of that. We would also encourage you to just take the time. Building trust generally takes that time, and while formalised plans are certainly important in the work that they do, we would encourage you not just to, this work is much broader than that, and so it's a horses for courses approach to how you might activate that particular approach in your locality. I think there's also been some really valuable reflections and learnings from the community groups that we've worked with around the role of paid staffing. And while there's no right or wrong way to do this work, there's been some deep learning, I think, in both the benefits, but also some of the challenges in terms of paid staffing and how to activate this work. And so we would encourage you to think broadly around, how to get the job done, because while we absolutely recognise the volunteer load that volunteers have, there's a variety of ways, particularly the embracing of technology, partnering with local paid organisations, a whole range of ways to think around and think through problems and activating your local networks in order to do that. Intermediary organisations also play a really valuable role in this work. I think because it is so complex in particular locations, just simply playing a role of joining the dots between stakeholders and being an interpreter of what are sometimes complex and formal constructs to try and simplify that so community members can understand, and in order to just crack on and get the work done, is a really incredibly important role. I also see great intermediaries really deeply and quietly encouraging inclusion over time. So that might be First Nations organisations, it might be people with a disability, it might be people with, people with severe, profound mental health issues. It could be a range of, different demographics in the community that all are recognised that needing unique supports in the event of a disaster. That too takes time. Keep in mind that good resilience building is not just trotting off to a simple workshop and then activating it via a grant. We recognise that it certainly takes time through interventions that we've heard about today, like community coaching, not-for-profit capacity building in those organisations themselves, flexible funding and funding over time, and the great work from the University of Sydney in participatory evaluation so communities can learn as they go. Thanks, Nancy. To our funders, our valuable funders and donors on the call, we really hope this work builds and adds to the evidence base that community-led models really are effective in building disaster resilience and supporting tailored strategies to mitigating the risk to people and communities in disasters. We absolutely see that there is deep value in multiple donors collaborating to come together to fund this long-term work. While the grants themselves are really modest, this work is can be done really on the smell of an oily rag. The grants we activated through this process were between $30,000 and $50,000, but the broader resourcing for the support mechanisms that we've talked about as an intermediary really take dedicated resourcing as well. We'd also encourage you to think about the dimensions and how you can use those as a useful tool to guide your thinking in future philanthropic investments in other communities. Certainly here at FRRR, we've theoretically threaded them through our Prepare and Recover disaster resilience building guidelines, and have found that a very useful way to guide investment into that sort of forward-looking investment, and what helps community members flourish into the future. And finally, for our government friends on the call, obviously local, state and federal play a really incredibly valuable and critical role within this context. And we would hope this work helps government navigate some of the complexity that occurs at a community level. Again, as Amanda spoke to, the significant value, tangible and non-tangible, in volunteer contributions, in leveraging the deep and rich and amazing local knowledge, and really helping that information flow in communities that we know is so important during a disaster response effort. Multi-year funding really is critical to this work. As Amanda said, this work doesn't get done in a year, particularly when you have disruptions like COVID, but just overlaid disasters, other types of disruptions to communities can occur. That's the reality of community life. We also see and would encourage our government partners to consider flexible policy frameworks and funding guidelines to enable project structures to accommodate changing community life over time, rather than prescribing strict solutions or rigid constructs about what community resilience building might look like in one community compared to the next. We're always fascinated as to how communities what resilience building looks like in one community to the next. And I think we've heard today just how diverse that can be. And finally, we genuinely believe that small grants have an amazing impact. It's not always money. Sometimes low cost or no cost ideas, have the greatest impact in small regional communities. One of the wonderful things about regional communities, they're incredibly adept at leveraging their networks and resources to elevate the in-kind contributions and finding resources to be able to do that. So we do just have a little bit of time for Q&A. Nancy, I'm going to throw over to you to check the chat. If anyone has an observation, a question for any of our panellists today.
So there was a lot of interest in the chat in regards to plans that had been developed and mainly around the sharing of those resources. So I think connecting to what was referenced around connecting those resources across community, and FRRR can support that process. There was also a really lovely comment. I love how flexible and adaptable the process has been. It's so real. Potentially there could be some reflection around that flexibility and adaptability. There's also a question here from James Brenner from South Gippsland Council regarding, so there was a collaboration that occurred in Korumburra around the development of the community resilience plan, as well as support from a coach in regards to the community resilience plan toolbox. So potentially some additional capacity building supports for groups that are trying to activate projects like this. And Nina James has asked, has any further work been completed on the community resilience plan toolbox? And is it likely to be made public for communities and councils? So I think that's about that additional capacity building support for community groups.
Thanks, Jane. That's one of the things that we're considering at the moment. Certainly our approach is not about defining tools or resources that can be used or should be used in communities right across Victoria, but can certainly share with you offline where we're up to with regard to that, for sure.
That's nippy. In regards to, here we have another question just come in now. Wonderful presentation and congratulations to all involved. I'm interested in the comment from the community. I hope I am correct, from Myrtleford, about having to pause and reset. I am keen to hear a little more detail on what prompted this change in direction.
So Yeah, I think that was the main thing. And I think everybody, when they start out in a project like this, there's always some twists and turns throughout the project.
I think from the research point of view as well, it's probably a good illustration of what we're talking about with some of those complexity concepts around, emergence and so on, that I think the value of being able to be involved with this work over a period of time means being able to see how things can emerge unexpectedly, and that included a pandemic, can I say? Things emerge, but also solutions and opportunities and action emerges. Ideas and relationships emerge. And there are times, I think, probably for each of the communities in the DRFR Victoria project, where there were moments of saying, well, is this actually still what we really want to do? Is our energy better spent somewhere else to also work towards resilience building, but maybe not in the way that we first envisaged? I think Korumburra had another example of where there had been an idea about a project on some local infrastructure that it turned out the community was probably not best placed as a community group to proceed with that, but some very useful relationships and constructive work then was able to happen that progressed that, sorry. And the community group was then able to turn their attention to other things and say, well, if we don't need to be putting the energy into this now, what else might we do? And then new ideas and new projects and activities grew out of that. So I think, again, coming back to what Jill was saying, that opportunity to pause, take a moment, look around, think where things had happened that had led up to that, and then where they might go, which might mean a change of direction, but actually not an abandonment or a failure, but rather a different opportunity than had first been anticipated.
Sincere thanks to our community project groups who have stuck with us literally through a pandemic and a whole range of other disruptions, storms, whole range of things. Really value your tenacity and perseverance as this project has evolved over time. Thank you for your contribution and insights today. It really is valuable and adds to the richness here at FRRR. We love to elevate the voice of community. It's a really fantastic way to be able to do that. Before we close today, I really would like to take a moment to sincerely thank our valuable donors. Without their contributions and their trust in this work, we would not be able to undertake this great work with communities and with the University of Sydney. So a big shout out to the Sydney Myer Fund, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Maple Brown Family Foundation, Simon Kutcher and Partners, the Ronald Jeffrey Arnott Foundation, H&L Hecht Trust, Suncorp, Pinnacle Charitable Foundation and the Dot Cross Family Foundation. Sincere thanks to you all for enabling this fantastic community learning and what we hope will result in resilient communities for the future. Next slide. So we have released the report today. You can find that in our latest news section on the website. We're incredibly excited to be able to do that. That is on all of our social channels. Of course, if you'd like to dive into the reports more deeply or how discuss with us how we can work together into the future with this type of initiative, we'd very much welcome those conversations. So my contact details are there, or you can just call the main number of FRRR. So thank you. I know we have gone over a dash today, but thank you for your participation. Sincerely welcomed. Thank you.